Hi there, ladies and gents. It's Dan from Adventure More UK. Welcome to another episode of my podcast, Catch you on the Flip Side. Today's special guest is a filmmaker, philanthropist, and an adventure photographer. The man is Mr. Alex Hillary. How's it going, mate?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it, mate. I know for people that don't know, you're obviously on the complete opposite side of the world in New Zealand. So I appreciate you getting up relatively early to come and do this podcast.
It's not too bad.
Are you an early bird? Are you an early bird or?
Yeah, I tend to be an early bird, and it's really not that bad because a couple of days ago I was getting up at 4:30 in the morning for an adventure race. So 8:30 is feeling quite leisurely.
No, that's good. That's good. So, just first of all, for people that don't know, like for people that are in sort of the adventure sort of circuit or world, may recognise your last name. Now, for people that don't, do you want to quickly explain why your name is quite or very popular in the outdoor adventure world?
Oh well, in 1953, my grandfather he went to Nepal, and well, he actually was there beforehand, but he climbed Everest with Tenzing Norgay, and he was the first person to reach the summit. So that's where most people will know his name from.
Yeah. So obviously, for people like Sir Edmund Hillary. Like that for people that don't know, he's like the god of all mountaineering exploration. I feel that anyway, and like I said, being a child, like, 'cause how old were you when he passed away?
So I was quite young. I was 12
Okay,
and a half.
so were you like, because obviously growing up in that environment, because I know your dad did obviously followed a little bit in his footsteps as well.
Yeah.
So doing adventure, that must have been like inevitable. Like you must have just not been able to get away from it, or is it something you actually wanted to do?
It's definitely something I wanted to do, but my father in particular was very determined not to force it upon me. So he didn't drag me up a mountain at the age of 5, sort of thing.
Yeah.
It actually took me sort of saying, "I'm going climbing with crampons and an axe. Are you coming with me?" And then he went, "All right." And then we went.
Yeah.
But it's, adventure has been a part of my life and my childhood. Running around the rocks on the west coast of New Zealand, all sorts of crazy stuff. But yeah, it is. Adventure is I think the obligation of being a Hillary.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, like, you can't really get away from it. It's like if you're like, I don't know, Lionel Messi's son, you're probably going to be a footballer when you're older.
Well, maybe, but that's the thing.
Maybe.
Is most people expect me to be a mountaineer, but I wouldn't actually describe myself as a mountaineer, more an adventurer. I love going on kayaking trips, on running trips, and all sorts of different things. And so did you. Yeah.
Now, obviously, that's probably a good way. I was thinking about it, that's probably a good way of putting it, being an adventurer, because adventure is a kind of a. It's not a cliche term, but it's like people when they say adventure, like I always say to people, it doesn't mean that you have to go and climb mountains and you go and swim the English Channel or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Adventure for some people could be going outside and walking the dog for a couple of miles.
Exactly.
It's all sort of like what people's perception of adventure is.
Yeah.
And that's what I say to a lot of people. But obviously, there's extremes of that. I've spoke to people who, have swam the English Channel. They've sailed around the world or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And I know what you do. You do a multitude of things, really. Now, something I read about is I think you class yourself as a multi-role designer. Is that something? So again, what for people that don't know, what would you say that includes?
Well, I have quite a diverse range of things I do. I freelance in industrial design. So I studied industrial design, and you kind of learn graphic design, product design, everything through to service design. And so those are the sort of things I practice now. And now a lot of my work is in videography and film. So I kind of toss that all together under the multi-role designer title.
Do you have like a go-to, like a favorite, like for me, like I'm trying to get my head into sort of film videography and stuff like that, but I'm more sort of accustomed to photography, but I'm also trying a bit at, you know, design and stuff like that and product design. But is there something that you kind of prefer more than the others?
Oh, I love storytelling.
Yeah.
So I do find photography is one of my real passions because
Yeah.
it enables me to engage with a whole lot of really interesting stories, whether that be something in the mountains and the outdoors, or it be, you know, a sports program or a design program or something.
Yeah.
And it allows you to engage with the story and tell the story, but also, you know, allows you to experience it quite a lot. Whereas when you transition to sort of creating film, it becomes a lot more demanding. So that's why I like the photography. I prefer that. But yeah.
So yeah, I'm the same. Like I think it's obviously all about content, really. Like I know, you know, there'll be people who spend thousands and thousands of pounds, dollars, whatever it may be, on film equipment, camera gear, but you can take good photos with like a phone or whatever it may be. It's all about what's in the frame, I think. If you have a $10,000, you know, Canon, doesn't mean you're going to take an award-winning photo.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's how I look at it. Like, I don't have the most expensive camera in the world, but you know, when I was traveling around Australia, I got some really good photos. One thing I do love about the Southern Hemisphere, about Australia and particularly New Zealand, is the skies, the night skies, especially, because I like to test myself with astrophotography.
Yeah, fantastic.
And I feel like, obviously in the UK and probably most of Europe, it's quite condensed, it's quite populated, so the night skies are not that great. And when I was over in New Zealand and Australia, I got some amazing photos. You know, one of them photos you look at and you think, oh man, I actually took that photo.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it kind of spurs you to do more. But the thing is, like, people don't realise, I don't know if you're the same, like, I took a photo in Australia, and loads of people say, oh mate, that's amazing, you should put it on a canvas, you should do this, you should do that. But people don't realise that was about 300 photos in.
Right.
It was literally like, I was about 11 o'clock midnight, something like that. And it's about 300 photos, maybe 2 hours later.
Yeah.
And do you, what's your sort of medium when it comes to photography? Do you have a particular medium?
What do you mean by medium?
I mean, so like obviously for me, like I'd like to do landscapes. So is there anything?
Oh yeah. No, I love landscapes. Because for me, that's a big part of why I go out there. You know, I want to go on a trip, and you know, it might be a pack crafting sort of climbing trip, but it's all about that. Those are the tools that enable me to get to this place that I really want to visit. You know, might be some rocky outcrops on a like subalpine tussock plateau, and you know, that's what I want to go see, and that's what I want to photograph. But then I think, you know, a byproduct of that is you end up doing a lot of really cool activities, and so let's say that landscape and that adventure photography I really enjoy.
Yeah. So for yourself, do you spend a lot of time with other people, or do you prefer being by yourself when you're doing stuff like this?
Oh, look, if I do like, you know, the Tour de Mont Blanc or a trail, I'll often go on my own, so I can go lightweight and move really fast. And you know, the risk is quite low on things like that. But you know, I recently did a trip into the Irvine ice plateau, which is one of New Zealand's, you know, most remote locations in the whole country. And it's a pretty brutal, you know, it's brutal terrain. It's, you know, it's huge, steep, rocky bluffs, and just going there on your own is a no-go. You've got to go with a climbing partner. So with a lot of those kind of things, you always go in a group.
Yeah, no, I like on that side of it, I can understand. Like you say, when you've got low risk sort of stuff, like when, as I say, the Tour de Mont Blanc, I went with a friend, but you could, like you say, you did it by yourself.
Yeah.
But like you say, if you're going and doing some extreme mountaineering, like if you're climbing even going up to like base camp or even somewhere in Europe, even going probably up to Mont Blanc itself, it's not a good idea going by yourself. As much as there's a lot of people that do it. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people who go, but they're not necessarily with you.
Yeah,
they'll just be like, it's quite what's the word? It's quite the traffic's quite high, and I mean like people walking it and stuff. Do you have like a particular place in the world, or like, let's say New Zealand to start with? Do you have a particular place in New Zealand that you love going to?
The Fiordland and Mount Aspiring national parks, I just think are two of the most incredible places in the world. And they're visited in many places by a lot of people, but then there are huge, vast swathes of country where just no one goes. So I find it fascinating and frankly addicting to just like pursue those little locations, because they can be really, really hard to get to.
Because obviously a lot of people will know that New Zealand is probably one of the adventure capitals of the world. I think obviously you've got your bigger places, like you got Nepal and stuff like that with the Himalayas, but for ease of access and just sort of like in one country as small as New Zealand is, you can have big roaring cities like Auckland or Wellington.
Yeah.
But then you can go down to the glaciers and go snowboarding, skiing, and basically everything in between. And that's something I loved about it. I loved going to New Zealand because of that reason.
Yeah. No, the variety and contrast is fantastic. I've been traveling a lot over the past couple of years, and COVID has has settled me back in New Zealand for a while.
Yeah.
And honestly, I couldn't be happier. It's fantastic.
Yeah. So do you obviously sort of pre-COVID? Do you prefer, like, obviously you've been adventuring all over the world, or do you actually prefer being in your own being in New Zealand?
I do. Yeah. Like I've had this huge thirst to go and then see all sorts of places like Patagonia and the Himalayas and the Alps in Europe. But there is just so much to do here in New Zealand. So I've really come round and come back to home, I think, recently.
It's funny actually saying that, because I spoke to someone earlier about same for the UK.
Yeah.
Now, have you been to the UK before?
I have, but I haven't done nearly as much sort of outdoor stuff as I'd like to do.
Yeah. I feel like, so for instance, when I was in Australia, like people would say, I'd ask the same question and say, have you ever been to the UK? And I'm like, yeah. And like, where did you go? Like, I've been to London. I'm like, but that's not the UK. That's just London.
Yeah.
That's a very small part of it, especially in the sort of interests that we have. You could go to the Lake District, Peak District, Scotland, Wales, and there's so many other places. That's like me coming to you and saying, I've been to New Zealand, I've been to Auckland.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, that's it.
Yeah, I haven't been to any of the places you just listed, so it's very high on my list of priorities to get back there. And,
well, if we do get the opportunity, I'll take you up there one day. I live nearer to the Lake District than probably most of the other places, so that's the nearest place I live.
Sounds great.
Definitely. And going back to, obviously, I've probably not been to a nowhere near amount of places you've been, but I have been over the last sort of 10 years since I left the military. I've been to quite a few places over the years, but they always say there's no place like home, and especially for like, I feel like New Zealand and the UK are very, very similar in this way that we are, as in, we don't have. I suppose we do have glaciers and snowboarding, but obviously up in the winter in Scotland and stuff like that. But I suppose we are very similar. I feel like it's kind of like, obviously being New Zealand being a lot smaller in population, but I feel like we are very similar in that aspect of adventure.
Well, I think it's something that comes of being an island nation, I suppose. It's a relatively small island nation, both in terms of your environment, but also sort of the attitude of people. And in New Zealand, there's a huge outdoor culture, and I think the UK has been the pioneering country for mountaineering, since the conception of it, really. I was reading a book by Robert McFarlane about that, how it was all Brits traveling into the Alps that were exploring the mountains and sort of creating mountaineering.
Yeah. It's obviously there's a lot to be said about British mountaineering, but if we go back to what you were saying earlier, like end of the day, the pioneer of mountaineering is obviously your granddad. Like it's like if someone was to mention his name, like everyone knows what he did. I would, and it's gonna, for me personally, I would say he is on the same level, but in a slightly different aspect of nature and wildlife and what have you, of David Attenborough. I personally think, like from my personal point of view, and obviously people who are into their adventure and exploration and stuff would consider him to be on the same par. Yeah. Obviously, they were actually not far off, probably a similar age, weren't they? Or be it, a few years.
So he died I think he'd be a little bit older than David Attenborough. But yeah, I do find that quite interesting, because I wouldn't say Ed was a pioneer of mountaineering as such.
Okay.
But he was, I think, uniquely positioned. He was fascinated by technology, by the oxygen setups, the new down jackets, and then in Antarctica, tractors and sort of utilizing tech, and then with his philanthropy in Nepal, bringing aircraft in. And so it was that sort of appreciation of technology that enabled him to have all his successes in the Himalayas and in Antarctica. And so he wasn't, designing these new oxygen setups, but I think he really embraced them and learned how to use them really well. And it was quite successful. History tells, I suppose. Which brings me on to the
it's the Edmund Hillary collection that you're a part of as well. So for people who don't know what that is, do you want to quickly explain what it is?
So my family were approached by some businessmen in New Zealand about creating a brand that sort of embodied, I guess, the ethos of Ed and what he stood for. And so it's a clothing brand creating sort of adventure inclined clothing. So it's not your hardcore Gore-Tex mountaineering down jackets. It's wearable clothing for around town. But we've tried to sort of bring together stories of Ed's climb. So one of the jackets that the collection has is actually made out of the same Ventile cotton that's made in the UK that was supplied to the original Everest expedition. So contacted the original factory to create a modern garment for today based on sort of the same story and the same tech of the 50s.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And again, like what he did would probably, I know nowadays, like you say, people use oxygen and they have all the gear and stuff like that, but from what I've seen, it seems like he did it with pretty much not bare minimum, but like something that people would consider a bit crazy nowadays.
Yeah. No, it truly is fascinating, because I've for a long time we had a lot of his old climbing gear in our family home attic, and as a kid I'd go up into the attic and cause chaos and play with old ice axes and boots, and then one day the Auckland Museum showed up and they decided they would like some of this climbing gear for their collection, so they got out their white gloves and picked up the boots. And put them in a box, and I'd been tossing these around for years. But now that I look back at it, these boots that they wore were horrible. They were heavy, they were leather, they weren't even properly sealed. The technology was the best of its day, but it was unbelievably primitive. And I'm honestly constantly flabbergasted by the fact that they were going up this huge mountain into the complete unknown and they had this gear that was just, frankly, really subpar. From today's perspective, but they just did it, and it's a true marvel. Like today, we got, people climb Everest all the time, but you have the best tried and tested gear. You know the route is possible, and it's already roped up. And so the fact that they did it with the gear they had is really incredible.
Yeah. No, it's. I read an interesting article because was it that someone actually, in inverted commas, summited Everest before your granddad, but he couldn't prove it or something like that. I read something similar. Yeah.
So there's Mallory and Irvine. So Mallory was one of the really was one of the great pioneers of Everest, trying to get to the top of Everest. So, back in the day, he was heading into Tibet, which was a closed country, and he would sneak in and try explore the northern side of Everest to see if there was a way up, and then again from the south side. And so Mallory and Irvine went up Everest, and they were seen very high on Everest. And then they disappeared, they died on the mountain. And in 2007, I believe, Mallory showed up, found by Conrad Anker in a glacier.
Wow.
And so there's this sort of thing of the probability it's extremely unlikely they got to the top. If Ed had primitive gear, they had nothing.
Nothing.
And so the fact that they got as far as they did is incredible. The likelihood they got to the summit's quite low. But it is very interesting because somewhere on Mount Everest is Irvine's camera and Irvine himself.
Really?
And so, it'd be quite interesting to see that camera and if it even, is totally destroyed or not. But, maybe they did get to the summit. Who knows?
Yeah, that'd actually be really interesting because there'd be old film cameras, wouldn't there? So
yeah,
the chances of being able to recover the footage, they'd probably be quite reasonable, I would say. Because if it's been entrapped in the glacier for all these years.
Yeah,
I feel like it would be pretty reasonable to say that they could recover the photographs.
Potentially.
That's pretty potentially. Yeah, potentially.
You just got to find a very small needle in a very large Everest-sized haystack.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it something you've ever thought about doing yourself? Like, because you haven't summited Everest, have you, or have you?
I have not. No. I actually had plans to go to Everest last year.
Okay.
The COVID and the world had different things to say about that. And now the environment is quite uncertain. So I don't know when I'll next be in the Himalayas or trying to climb Everest. But it's definitely something I'm thinking about a lot in terms of how to make it work and how I would like to climb Everest. That's quite important to me. Yeah.
And would you take the more traditional route that your granddad did, or are you thinking about doing it maybe a slightly different way?
No, I'd love to do. Everest is a fascinating mountain, and it's simplified so much. There's so many incredible features to the mountain, incredible routes that have been done and that haven't been done, and people just overlook that for just the little, tippy top. But no, I would start off with that standard route. I'd just like to do it in a more traditional fashion. I'd like to do it more, self-sufficient. I think I would probably use oxygen, but try keep that to a bare minimum. And try climb it on my own terms.
That would be quite an incredible feat, that, because I know, and his name forgives me, but there's a fella who's he's an ex Special Forces, British Special Forces operator who he summited every summit above 8,000 meters in a. I think it was a. It's good. No, you're thinking of Ant Middleton, aren't you?
Yeah.
Is that who you're thinking of? No, this is a Gurkha guide. He's former Special Forces.
Nirmal Purja.
That's the one. Yeah. NIMS. Is it NIMS they call it?
NIMS. Yeah.
Yeah. He I watched a documentary about him, and he did it all by himself. Well, obviously he had times where he had teams, but he did it all. I think he did no oxygen. At one point, he gave his oxygen tank to I think it was a casualty who was getting rescued down from one of the summits.
Yeah,
and he'd carried on by himself with the rest of it. I think for people who don't know, who have never sort of witnessed or watched any documentaries on Everest, won't realise the sort of extremities of the climate and, you know, the weather on Everest. Like I've never been in that part of the world. It's on my bucket list to go there.
Yeah.
Maybe not summit Everest, but I'd be happy with base camp. I'd be happy with that. But we have strong winds, etc. in the UK, but they're really not strong winds. You know, you're looking at over 100-kilometre-hour winds on Everest, and minus
winds
6.
That'll shred tents, literally just rip them apart and throw them into the sky.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're looking, you know, well into the minus sort of 40, 50, 60 degrees centigrade. And for people who haven't been in even nowhere near half of that, can't comprehend how cold that actually is.
Yeah.
You know. So speaking of cold, I know you mentioned before about the Antarctic Heritage Trust that you now started working alongside.
Yeah.
That's so. What is it you actually do with them?
Well, so I'm an ambassador for the trust. I went down to Antarctica. It's now 2 years ago. We did a short kayaking trip down there. So we kayaked around, not around the peninsula, but we kayaked in different locations along the peninsula. And I guess the idea was we wanted to take this group of young New Zealanders from all different walks of life and different ages to explore Antarctica, and both the wildlife but also the history there, because there's so much rich history, and it's quite fascinating because Antarctica has the only first house ever built on the continent. So we don't know where the first house ever built was on any continent, in the world, apart from Antarctica. And that house is still there.
Really? Yeah.
And so that's what the trust is about, is preserving these little pieces of history that are genuinely frozen in time, and kind of spreading that story.
Yeah. So how long ago was the house built?
Ooh. So it's all within, the past 120 years. All of that stuff has happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact date of that hut, unfortunately.
Oh, no, that's all right. Now, would you consider going to Antarctic, like going to the North Pole, etc.?
The Arctic. Yes.
The Arctic, sorry.
I'd love to head up to the Arctic, actually. That whole area around Svalbard, it's fascinating.
It's actually before I went to Australia, one of my goals in life before I turned 30 was to go to Svalbard.
Yeah.
But obviously, people who don't know where that is, it's obviously the big sort of set of islands above sort of where Norway is, and it's obviously part of the Arctic Circle.
Yeah.
And I think it's the highest it's the highest settlement on Earth, like as latitude, longitude.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, most northerly.
Northernly. Yeah, it's somewhere I've looked at. Doing the old cliche kind of tours and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because I think for me personally, I don't think I'd be able to go and do my own thing there. I wouldn't say I'm too confident in doing that.
Well, that's the interesting thing about the Arctic is the Antarctic is, the Antarctic it's a continent, right? So it has its own sort of ecosystem. There's incredibly interesting weather patterns. That's sort of while it is warming because of climate change, it is sort of keeping itself cool at the same time, whereas the Arctic isn't, and the Arctic's just sea really, and so it's changing so much up there, and that's why I'm really keen to get up there, is because by the end of our lives, it's going to be gone, and recently I watched a trip by Mike Horn and Borge Ausland where they crossed it. in the middle of winter. One of the most incredible feats.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's become infinitely harder in their lifetimes to do things up there, because now there are more leads, more splits in the ice, where there's freezing cold water with all sorts of shoss in it, and it's just a changing environment faster than any other on the planet.
Yeah. But would you say those dangers make it more not inviting, but like it makes people want to do it so much more? Because obviously people like to sort of test themselves and put themselves right on the sort of line of life and death. Do you not feel?
Yeah, it depends what you get out there for. Like I know
True.
many people go out there for that risk and that danger, and they want to create something very dramatic. And if that's what you want to do, then the Arctic's probably a very good place to do it. But for me, it's more about exploring wonderful places. And so if that danger is part of that journey, then well, cool. Like that makes it very exciting, and that's a challenge you've got to analyze. You've got to, it's a physical challenge and it's a mental challenge, and it definitely makes it really, really interesting. Yeah,
absolutely. So, whilst you've been on plenty of your adventures, have you been anywhere that you deemed for, like, could be quite considerably dangerous, like, or could have turned into danger? Is there anything like that you'd come across before?
Well,
you just thought it's not good.
That's the interesting thing. Is like, as you said before, it's weather. Things can turn. Things can be absolute paradise, and you can be sitting there having a cup of tea and climbing away, happy as Larry, and then it can just be life or death. The year before last year, rather, in 2019, at the end in November, December, I was climbing an Ama Dablam, which is just down from Mount Everest in the Everest region of Nepal, and it's nearly a 7,000 meter mountain, 6,900 meters. And we were high up on the summit, so we'd been doing some filming. We were camping at Camp 3 on the mountain. So Ama Dablam essentially means like Mother Locket. So it's the mother mountain of the valley. So when you hike up to Everest Base Camp, there's just the most beautiful mountain in the world. And I know a lot of Europeans will say, no, we have the most beautiful mountain, which is the Matterhorn. But this is the Matterhorn of the Himalayas, and it's, I think, twice the size. And it's got big, broad shoulders, and it's this huge, like, incredibly dramatic peak with this hanging glacier that's just hanging there. And it just breaks off and rains ice down onto this huge 2,500, 3,000 meter drop. Incredible mountain. And so we were camped right below that Dablam. And there was a Japanese couple up there who ended up getting incredibly bad altitude sickness. So they were freezing up around the face. They, eyes rolling back into their head, losing control of their arms and legs, stumbling all over the place. And we had really nice weather. But things can get really, really dangerous, and that was a big eye opener for me, because I've never been in that extreme of a situation myself. But to see someone that is just so incapacitated, it was pretty scary. And they ended up being long lined by helicopter out of a camp there at 6,300 meters. And so I guess by osmosis, I was sort of. It was a pretty scary situation.
Yeah, I can imagine. Obviously, from my sort of background, the dangers from where I obviously being in the military are completely different to what obviously mountaineering, etc. But I can kind of understand the kind of I can't think of the word, but like just the sheer sort of like fear of what could happen. Now, obviously, when you do stuff like that, does that ever come into your head? Like, do you ever think, like, this could happen or this could, or do you just do it?
Oh, no, it definitely goes into my head. I tend to be, I think a lot about the trips that I'm doing and the risks involved. I think that's really important because, you need to be aware of the risks when you're going into something like this. Otherwise, it's just being irresponsible and reckless.
Yeah, exactly.
The people that rescued that Japanese guy, they were taking enormous risks to rescue him. So you've got to think about what you're getting yourself into. Yeah. So I definitely, it's very much in the forefront of my mind.
Yeah. So when, for instance, you're planning these expeditions, do you take friends with you, or like, people you go climbing with? Do you take them quite regularly?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing, is it's sort of like, it's the constant struggle of finding a climbing partner, I suppose.
Yeah.
You got to organize, when people are free and where people are, and, skill levels and that sort of thing. But I'm really lucky to do a lot of stuff with my brother.
Okay.
So I have an older step brother, half brother rather.
Yeah.
And we've done a lot of stuff together, and we work really well together as a team. And I must admit, it's a real joy to climb with him. We were on Amada Blam together, and I guess that, you're very close as climbing partners, no matter what. But as brothers, it's also quite nice because you've got that extra connection.
Yeah, it's all about, I suppose it's about trust as well. You've got to trust that he can do, when, stuff does hit the fan, then it potentially, he could, you'd think he'd be able to help in whatever situation it would be, and obviously vice versa.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. So I think I can understand, like, for me, like climbing, I do rock climbing, and most people will know, you can't climb by yourself realistically, not unless you do free soloing, which is ridiculous. Like, it's not a thing I fancy getting into. But except obviously we talk a lot about you doing mountaineering and your adventures and stuff. Is there anything, like, do you do anything else? Like, do you do any other sports or any other hobbies or interests that you kind of like do that people might not necessarily know about?
Oh, look, I think, the outdoors is a big part of my life. And, I do a lot of running and training to sort of enable myself to go out and push myself harder in the outdoors. But, I'm just a normal person. So I like, gardening, having a veggie garden. I've actually, during COVID, sort of hilariously, I've been getting into whittling some spoons and little things for the...
Really? Oh, okay.
Whatever. But the outdoors is my great passion. It's sort of the thing that brings a lot of quality to my life.
Yeah. I was going to say, COVID has brought a few interesting things into people's lives. Like, for me, I started doing jigsaws. Like,
nice. Yeah.
it's people might think that's like what old people do, but I quite enjoy it. Like, I started off with some smaller ones. Don't get me wrong, I'm not doing like my niece's sort of Peppa Pig like things, but I'm doing some decent ones. But so it's interesting. So I suppose when you were younger, like, do you get treated differently? Because I'm assuming, like, in New Zealand, obviously, your granddad would have been pretty much a local celebrity, I would say. So did you get treated differently, or people didn't really care?
That's the interesting thing, because, like Ed, for people that don't know, he's on the $5 note in New Zealand. And he was the only, New Zealander to ever be on a $5 note while he was alive, which must have been quite unusual for him, I must admit. But it was unusual for me too, because he is a big figure in New Zealand, and growing up with that, a lot of people are aware. But I think there was something about the New Zealand culture. We're a very laid back culture, so there wasn't too much fuss. Which was great. Otherwise, it would have been quite difficult. But it definitely was there.
Yeah. So whereabouts did you grow up? Did you grow up around Auckland, or did you grow up a bit further south?
No. So I grew up in Auckland, but spent a lot of time, outside of Auckland. We'd go on trips every weekend. So I grew up, in the mountains and on the coast and stuff.
So when you were younger, i.e., when you were at school, did you were you like one of them guys who sort of like people just want to be your friend because of who you are and who your granddad was, or did you not really have that problem? Like, were you like the popular kid?
No, I wouldn't say I was the popular kid.
No.
No, I just always wanted to go off and, run around the rocks and climb trees and all that sort of stuff. Like, I guess there were things like that where people were interested in me because of my family connections. But at the end of the day, those sort of relationships never really last very long.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, like you probably sussed that out pretty quickly if that was the case. So I can understand that. So you do a lot of traveling around the world. Is there, for instance, one place you would love to go back to, or is there a place you wouldn't like to go back to, or both?
One place I'd love to go back to is Patagonia.
Okay, yeah.
So in Argentina and Chile, and because I went there with a friend of mine as soon as I left high school. So I finished high school and I went to Patagonia, and it was incredible. I was totally unprepared. I did a 11-day hike and ran out of food and got extraordinarily hungry. But I was just blown away by the mountains there. And the rivers and the lakes. The opportunities for adventure there are just incredible. Like, I'd love to go do a pack rafting climbing mission up there, but at that stage of my life, all I was really doing was hiking. Yeah.
That's one place I do want to go to is that, South America in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, so is there places you probably would not like to go back to?
Florida,
really?
No desire to go back to Florida.
No, was that more of a? I can only assume that wasn't a hiking thing because there isn't. It's flat as anything.
Yeah. Well, actually, the Everglades would be pretty cool to see, but I didn't see the Everglades.
No, that's fair enough. So going forward, is there places you want to go and visit that haven't been? That maybe I know you mentioned earlier about you wanting to do the trip that you was meant to do last year. But is there anything else you're trying to sort of plan, especially at the moment? I suppose actually, sorry, going back to like obviously here in the UK we're pretty much like grounded because of COVID. But I believe like you guys are pretty like it's non-existent now, or is it? It's very rare.
We're free as a bird in our little New Zealand cage. We can do anything. You don't have to really wear masks, we have some COVID and quarantine facilities that coming into the country, but no community transmission. So there's New Zealand's open season, so I've been planning all sorts of trips around here. Definitely are mulling on some ideas for when things start to open up. Very keen to get down to South Georgia at some point.
Okay.
Yeah, for a wee trip.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say it must be difficult then, knowing that in New Zealand you can go pretty much wherever you want. Well, you can go anywhere you want, but it's just everyone else around that. Obviously, everyone's closing borders, and you're not able to go anywhere. So it must be quite frustrating, really.
It was frustrating for me, when it first started, like it was for everyone. But I just think you've got to evolve and adapt.
Absolutely.
And that's a big thing about mountaineering is you go, well, okay, I was trying to climb this peak, but the weather means it doesn't work out. So what else can I do? And that's what I'm doing now. I can't climb in the Himalayas, but what else can I do? Well, New Zealand just has a bounty of kayaking adventures, bike adventures. Yep. So that's the plan.
Where's your favourite place to go in New Zealand?
I think like what I said before with Mount Aspiring National Park and Fiordland. Just because of it's unbelievable. You've got these ancient forests that are just so lush. Huge gorges, incredible rivers, fjords, and then you've got this incredible subalpine terrain with glaciers and mountains. The adventure opportunities are limitless. I just went on an adventure race one of my first adventure races.
Yeah.
And
how was that?
I got my ass kicked.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Which is incredible because like there's such a difference between being a good mountaineer and being a good adventure racer, and all there's so much variety in how you train for the sports, and I could handle the country. We were going backcountry through Fiordland for about 150 kilometers, carrying pack crafts and all that sort of stuff. And I just found I wasn't, myself and our team, we weren't moving fast enough. And these guys that specifically do adventure races are incredibly quick at just maintaining that high intensity. Whereas for what I normally do, which is these longer expeditions, it's more about stamina and just being slow and steady, really.
Yeah. So what sort of what do you do as your training nowadays? Like, do you have a particular training plan, or do you just kind of wing it in a way?
So there's a fair amount of winging it, because I find the routines can often be quite hard to maintain with me moving around a lot. But I definitely what my training Bible is Steve House and Scott Johnson's Training for the New Alpinism, where they sort of outline pretty solid, routines for training for high altitude and high altitude sports. So it's a lot of running really, and sort of try to do strength training as well.
Awesome. Now, last thing, one of the last things I want to ask you. So, I know a lot of people who hopefully listen to the podcast. As I mentioned earlier, I talk a lot about mental health and stuff like that. Now, when you're on your adventures, I know sometimes you might be by yourself. How do you keep yourself sort of positive?
Well, I think you're out. For me, I'm out there, and that's where I love to be. And that's the thing that gives me the refresh, I suppose. So like anyone, it's mental health is a constant balance. You got to find it, and during COVID last year, I definitely struggled. And so I know that one of the ways that I can help my mental health is by going out into the outdoors, and I guess that's how it works with me. But when I'm out there, sure, you have high points and low points, and I think it's just about addressing it as an emotion and not letting yourself get swept away in it. So if I'm out there alone and I start to feel a bit sad, like I don't want to be here, well, you try heat up a nice cup of coffee, something comfortable, and go away from the target, from the mission, and just think about something nice. Like I'll think about my dog. And I guess that's how you keep it going and you keep pushing.
So I think a lot of people personally I think it's about setting yourself a goal, because I know a lot of people just go on about their lives without actually not really having any goals. They'll just kind of 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, and just do their own thing without actually wanting to achieve anything. And don't get me wrong, in some instances that's okay, but personally, if you want to have a good sort of happy, positive kind of life, you need to strive to some sort of goal. And again, I said this earlier, it doesn't have to be, climbing Everest. It doesn't have to be, swimming wherever. For some people, it's getting off their arse and going for a walk.
Totally. Yeah.
Or like I said, it could be anything. Like I said, it could be doing a jigsaw like I do.
Yeah.
But I suppose that's the kind of the main message for me. Is just do something.
Exactly.
Don't sit at home doing nothing, because that's going to probably make you worse.
Yeah.
Which that's the sort of message I want to try and give to people. Now, my last question to you, Alex, is if you could go on any adventure, and in your instance, it'll have to be outside of your family, because I know you'd want to do something with your family, and I'm sure I would. Who would you go with if you just pick one person, and where would you go, and what would you do? Sorry, one thing I will say is it can't be hiking or mountaineering, because that's something that I know you do a lot of.
Okay.
Something else.
Yeah. So look, I've through my work with the Antarctic Heritage Trust, I met a kayaker called Mike Dawson.
Okay.
So he's one of New Zealand's Olympic kayakers, and we became quite good friends, and have got into a whole bunch of. We've done some interesting trips. I took him mountaineering, and he took me kayaking around Stewart Island. So it's a 250 kilometer circumnavigation of one of New Zealand's most southernmost islands, where I was wildly out of my depth. I can kayak, but this was serious, like, out there, big seas. We were looking at the forecast, and there was 6-meter waves with high winds, sort of, and I'm just going, oh my gosh! But I loved it. It was fantastic. I was terrified, but I loved it. And I'm really keen to do some more kayaking missions with Mike. And one of those which we've sort of pondered is South Georgia, in the near Antarctica. And I have a very, very, very long way to go before that would happen, which is sort of what makes me so excited about it. Is there's so many skills I've got to learn, so much strength I've got to gain, and confidence, really, to get out there in the middle of nowhere and do this circumnavigation.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose at the moment with what's happening, we can't really go anywhere, so probably got a lot of time to sort of prepare for your challenge. Yeah. But that's so pretty interesting. Like for me, I've said this before, but do you know Leveson Wood? Or heard of Leveson Wood?
No.
If you haven't, you'll have to Google him. He's an incredible guy. I've said this before. He's like myself. He's ex-military. He's British as well, and he's done things that you might, if you have potentially heard of him. He's done things like walking the Himalayas, walking the Nile. He's done Russia to Iran, and loads of other things. And he's just a cool guy. Like he's like yourself. He's a photographer and film like videographer. And he tells his stories by photos and just meeting people along the way, and that's sort of something I like about him. It's just there's no sort of like. So, for instance, like Bear Grylls, don't get me wrong, he's a nice guy. I've actually met him many years ago. But he is quite eccentric, like especially for for TV and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong, he does some stuff that like are interesting and there's just lessons to be learned. But he's quite extreme, as in the sense of being
dramatic.
Dramatic. Yeah. So. He isn't. So Leveson isn't. He's very much just how he is. Like I've met him a few years ago, and talked to him about it, and he is literally just how he is. So I highly recommend googling him. But like I said, thanks for chatting to us, mate. It's been I know that it's been trying to get in touch with you and stuff like that. I know you're always out and about, so it's a bit of a pain, but it's all good. We got there in the end. So yeah, like I said, I really appreciate it, mate. It's been good, and as I say, my offer's always there. If you're ever in the UK, I could quite happily I'm sure you'll probably beast me more than anything up and down our very little sort of mountains that we have in the UK compared to New Zealand and some of the other places you've been to.
Sounds like fantastic. I'm looking forward to getting over there at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be quite a while, but it'll happen one day, and it's just about getting on with it, and hopefully one day we will get back to relative sort of normality. But as I say, mate, I really appreciate it. It's been good chatting. And for all sort of like your social medias, is there places where people can find you and keep up on your sort of travels and adventures?
Yeah, I'm definitely pretty active on Instagram. That'd be the place to see what I'm up to.
Yeah, awesome. So like I said, appreciate it, mate. I'll put that in the description and make sure everyone can keep in touch with it or keep an eye on what you're doing. Awesome. And again, for myself, keep an eye on what I'm doing on my podcast. I've got my YouTube now and my Instagram, etc. I'll put all that in the description. And if I don't catch you soon, I'll catch you on this flip side.